Welcome, everyone, to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, whoever you love, whatever you believe, you are welcome here. Today is Biblical Scholarship and Literacy Lecture. I think it's actually 25, not 24, but I should check. The Holiness Code, which is the second half of Leviticus 17 through 27. I want to remind everyone that we do have a class syllabus that has links to the lectures, the recordings of the lectures. It has links to notes, sometimes handouts, sometimes and a list of things you can do to go back in time or to review some of this material if you'd like. There's also a calendar. We struggle to keep that up to date because, for example, we moved this week's class and I think the calendar was wrong, but I'll do my best to keep that up to date so you can figure out when the next classes are coming. And so let's review what we've done. The book of Leviticus, we did it in three parts. The first half is the rules for the priests, then the Holiness Code, and then the addendum concerning the vows, dedications, and tithes is chapter 27. So that's the structure of the book. We did the first bit, 1 through 15, in the first lecture. And then the second lecture was the Day of Atonement back in November. And then today we'll do Leviticus 17 through 27, the end of it, the Holiness Code. And then in February, I believe right now we're scheduled for February 26th. I'll let you know if that changes. We'll do an introduction to the book of Numbers. And I haven't yet gone through Numbers and decided how many separate lectures that one will be. But there'll be one or more lectures on the book of Numbers, which will start in February 26th. So last lecture was about the Day of Atonement, which is the ritual whereby Israel cleansed their sanctuary of impurities that may have accumulated over the course of the year. It's part of a ritual festival that happened once a year. We compared it to the Babylonian Akitu festival, the Egyptian daily temple ritual from Karnak, and the Hittite plague removal rituals, and we made comparisons to all those, and we talked about how this particular ritual has impacted Christian belief and traditions. And the main theme there was that the temple and its sanctuary was designed to represent a reversal of the fall. The creation, the fall, and the atonement are the mythical elements that are embodied in the temple rituals presented in the Day of Atonement, where the priest, for example, in the fall, Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden heading east, and then in the Day of Atonement, the priest re-enters the Garden of Eden facing west. And the tabernacle here, as you can see, is this representation of that journey back to the presence of the Lord. All right. So today, what we're going to do is we need to quickly review the documentary hypothesis, which is the theory of who wrote the biblical text for the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. We'll talk about the different authors, J, E, P, and D, and then the redactor who put these things together, which we will call R. We'll also talk about then the text of Leviticus 17 through 27. We'll talk briefly about its authorship, who wrote it, H. But then we'll talk about the reasons, and this is kind of an important thing because it pertains to all of these documents, why we believe that there are distinct authors. Specifically, why is H distinct from P? You notice H is not listed in the standard documentary hypothesis. It's a way of splitting P in half, that we believe that there's 2 distinct parts to this P text, and one of them we call H, which is the author of the second half of Leviticus. One of the reasons for distinct authorship is going to be contradictions, which we will then allow us to launch into a sub-discussion of contradictions in the Bible in general and the implications that has for how we interpret the Bible, specifically how apologists interpret the Bible, how atheists, in this case I mean those who want to convince people not to believe, not just anyone who doesn't believe, will interpret those contradictions, and then we'll talk about what they mean for kind of the biblical scholarship position, all 3. All right, so let's review the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis is a way of looking at authorship for the first 5 books of the Bible. There's J, the Yahwist, who's probably the earliest author, wrote about the 10th century BC. There's E, the Elohist, called that because they use different names for God, who wrote at the beginning anyway, who wrote in the 9th century, probably the Deuteronomist, who wrote in the 7th century, and then the priestly source, who wrote in the 5th century. the redactor who then put these things together at the end. We believe that J and E were combined first, and then the redactor put together D, J, E, and P into one final text, which is the first 5 books of Moses. D is found primarily in the book of Deuteronomy, so it's one we haven't yet seen. P wrote almost all of Leviticus, all of Leviticus, but then we say that we believe that we can make a distinction between P and H. H is this new proposed source that wrote the second half. In other words, the first half is by the normal P author that we see, and then the second half of Leviticus is its own thing, a separate tradition of law in the Bible that we believe is distinct. We'll talk about why we think it's distinct. So it's kind of an addition to what we normally see in this standard documentary hypothesis. I don't know, and I know that there are competing theories. And so when there are competing theories, I think we should kind of maybe let them rest a little bit. But when we talk about who wrote H, when it was written, there's debates about whether H came first and then P, or whether P came first and then H. Was H written before Deuteronomy, after Deuteronomy? There are debates here. And so because there is disagreement, I'm not going to get into that. We'll just talk about some of the reasons we believe they're distinct. There are several reasons. The first is duplication of laws, a difference in word usage, a difference in themes and theology, and contradictions, straight-up contradictions between the two theories. Now, a critique that is often thrown at the documentary hypothesis, these reasons for different authorship are the same reasons we would give for differentiating D and P, for example. One of the contradictions, or one of the arguments used against the documentary hypothesis is that it's circular reasoning. What people do is we separate the text into different pieces, we make theories about how those different pieces are different, and then we divide them up so that those differences match, so that the theory of what makes them different leads to the division, and the division then leads to the theory of what is different, and in a circular way, these arguments support each other, and then therefore we don't actually know that this is true. I'm going to argue that that is a fair critique, but it's not convincing to me, because duplication, distinct differences in word usage, and complete differences in themes and theology, and straight-up contradictions force us, I believe, to address why these contradictions exist. And if you're interested in the study of epistemology, why we believe what we believe, I would say that the documentary hypothesis is the simplest theory that has the most explanatory power. It explains these duplications, word usage differences, themes, and contradictions while making as few additional assumptions as possible. And it also has external support. For example, we're beginning to piece together an age of Hebrew, where we can tell certain words are older, so if the 1980s don't feel like they were that long ago to me, but they were probably a long time ago. I'm getting old, but you can tell when something was kind of written in the 1980s already by some of the word usage. If you have a lot of times people saying, "Man, that's bad, dude," this is 1980s talk. As we begin to construct from external sources a history of the Hebrew language, we also begin to recognize differences in the different word usage. We can also begin to recognize issues of dating. And so, again, the critique is circular reasoning. I agree that there is some circular reasoning to this idea of dividing it up, then having differences based on how it's divided, which then supports the idea that they were different authors. So we have to be careful. But I believe there's enough external support that this is the best explanation for these issues that we have. So, yeah, go ahead.
So have people done, like hypothesis-free text analysis where you just have a computer crank through the text?
So let me, for those who are online, the question was, have people done computer-assisted text clustering? Yes.
And hypothesis-free.
Whether they've done it in a hypothesis-free way, I'm not sure. So some of my research was related to some of this statistical text-based analysis of languages. And so I used to, about 10 years ago, be qualified to answer your question. I don't know what's been done in the last 10 years. I do know that people have done clustering, where they've tried to let the computer kind of cluster based on word usage, and they find some of these divisions fall out naturally from the computer on their own. I know that has been used to do things in the New Testament, like argue that Paul didn't write certain of the letters because they cluster differently than the others in terms of their word usage. But I don't know how many inputs. Each of these studies have been done differently. So some of them I know have put in certain pieces that they believe really are. So let me talk about the Paul version, the New Testament, because that one I know best. There was a study, for example, that put in the letters of Paul that are most commonly affirmed as really from Paul. And then they used that as the seed to create a word print for Pauline writing. And then they asked the question, are these other texts really by the same author or not? It was a same author or not question. And the answer came back, not same author, for some of them. So you can do it both from a context-free, where you're just clustering, or you can do it from kind of the seed, where then you can let it spread out. And I'm not sure exactly how the different studies have been done on the Old Testament. The fact of the matter is, I know that there are many, and so they're probably all different. You'd have to go through and read them, and there are even contradictory ones who come to different conclusions depending on the algorithm they use. So that is a whole area of study, or it used to be, and I assume still is, but it's not one that I've followed in the last few years, so I don't feel qualified to say. But if you just want a visual picture of this different word usage, this is from Strong's Exhaustive Concordance of the Bible. It's a concordance of the King James. So what it's got is, you look up a King James word here, like abomination. It's an appropriate one for the book of Leviticus. And it will give you, every time the King James uses the word abomination on the left, there are concordances for other versions of the scriptures, but this is the one I had because I bought it years and years ago. So here's every use of the word abomination. And you just visually, you notice in Genesis and Exodus, you have here a number. Now you take this number and look up the Hebrew word in a Hebrew dictionary at the end, referenced by number, which means you don't have to know Hebrew to find the word in a dictionary. But let's say you don't even want to go that far. You just look at the number. 8441 is used in Genesis and Exodus, and if I look those up, those are PE sources sort of things. And then suddenly, these are JE sources. And then suddenly I get to the first half of Leviticus, which we believe was written by P, and suddenly we get this different word usage, 8263. And where does it stop? Right here, the break is between Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 18. In other words, the hypothesis is H is distinct from P, and H is from Leviticus 17 on, and you see suddenly a shift in word usage. And you'll notice that shift in word usage is the same as the later Deuteronomy source. So here's what we think we know about H. H is sort of in between Deuteronomy and P. He acts much like a P source. He's interested in the priestly issues of cleanliness and holiness and ritual and stuff. So he's interested in all the things P is interested in, but he writes with a little bit of a Deuteronomic slant, almost like a Deuteronomistic word usage. And so this is immediately visible just looking at the concordance. You can see the break. You can see it move in its word usage of abomination. It's using a very different word for the abomination, meaning the thing that is unclean, by the way, in both instances. Yeah.
So you're saying that he uses a different word for A, or the two authors use a different word for abomination?
Yes. P uses the first word for abomination, this middle 6 whatever, and H uses this 8441, which is the same as Deuteronomy. And at one point, I could have actually told you what the Hebrew words were, and I started doing that again for my preparation, and I feel really embarrassed that I forgot to look them up and remind myself. But like I said, last time I actually seriously studied Hebrew was 10 years ago. But at one point, I could have actually told you this off the top of my head, and now I can't, and I should have reminded myself before class and didn't. In fact, I meant to and forgot. So you see immediately the word. You don't even have to do any real serious scholarship. You just look up one word that both of them use, in English anyway, abomination, and you see they're using very different words to describe the ritually unclean thing. But they also have a very distinct theology and theme when it deals with this material in Leviticus. So, for example, P is concerned with ritual cleanliness specifically to take care of the sacred space of the temple. And so you'll notice whenever you get into the first half, this part that's attributed to P, he's worried about uncleanliness polluting the temple. But when you get to H, it's all about the sacred space of the land itself. So one theory could be that H was written after the after the exile, and he's trying to explain why Israel was cast out of the land. And so for H, being ritually unclean will cause you to be cast out of the land because the whole land is sacred, and if you aren't ritually clean, you'll be expelled from the land. And so to keep yourself from being expelled, you have to be ritually clean. Well, if he's writing after the exile, that would make sense. He's trying to retroactively explain why the people were cast out. That's one of the theories. Again, because there are disagreements about when H was written, I'm not going to take a side on this. But you can see that the difference in theme. So P, because the priests are the ones who go into the temple, P is always concerned about the holiness of the priests. And so his laws are all about, don't touch a corpse. Who? Well, the priest shouldn't touch a corpse. Why? Because then they'll be ritually unclean and they can't go into the temple and then they can't officiate. So for P, there's nothing morally wrong about touching a corpse. It's just the priest shouldn't do it because that would make them ritually unclean and unable to enter the temple. H is interested in the holiness of the land. So people shouldn't be touching corpses at all, right? And if they do, they need to separate themselves because we need to not let this pollute the people because the people have to stay in line. That's a bad example because H actually cares a lot less about touching corpses and stuff. So for P, the impurity is primarily ritual, things like touching corpses. For H, the impurity can be ethical. So H is worried about incest. H is worried about having sex during menstruation. H is worried about homosexuality. So the passages against homosexuality come from H. And that's, again, part of the distinction. H is interested in those sorts of social taboos, which we will discuss in a bit. We'll try to deal with those head on. But H is interested in them because from H, the issues can be ethical as well as ritual. The ethical lapses of the sort that the author, the tradition ascribes as being ethical, whether we may not agree or not, can pollute the land and the people, which will then cause them to be expelled from the land. For P, impurity is temporary and easily dealt with. So, again, for P, if you were to do something that made you ritually impure, it's not a big deal. God's not mad. Just wash your clothes, remain unclean until the evening, offer a sacrifice, and you're all good to go. For H, if you do something like have sex with your mother, which he talks about being this horrible sin, incest, well, we put you to death. Because otherwise your impurity will spread to the people, and that will cause the entire people to be expelled from the land. It's not about something you can just wash your clothes and be done with. If you do this, death and expulsion are the result. So for H, the way purity of the people is maintained is by expelling those who do these things and or executing them. And then for both, this impurity is contagious. Now, I remember when I went to Israel with a study abroad program, it was a beautiful experience. We had a Muslim Arabic teacher, and we had a Jewish Hebrew teacher, and both of them taught a course on their language of the two groups. I took both. It was fascinating. And then they also taught a class on the religious tradition and the political tradition. So we got to hear about the Arab-Israeli conflict from an Arab individual and from a Jewish individual, both explaining it as they saw. So we got that from both sides. It was a fascinating course. I loved it. But I remember we had some pushback. He was teaching some of this sort of material, and we said, well, if you do certain things, it only hurts you. Why is that a problem? And he said, imagine if you're out on the lake, and he wasn't trying to express this as his own beliefs. He was trying to help us understand traditional Jewish beliefs. He said, imagine that you're out on a lake in a small boat, and you're trying to get to shore, and someone has a drill and is busy drilling a hole in the bottom of the boat. Does it just hurt him, or does it hurt everybody? Well, it hurts everybody. You've got to stop that person from drilling that hole, or you could all die. And so for these people, if this impurity polluted the land and could cause expulsion, you have to stop this person because it's not just something they're doing to themselves, it could hurt everybody. And so this is the kind of ethical framework in which the impurity is lasting, permanent, and needs to be removed by death, expulsion. Again, the point here isn't to advocate for that, but to try to understand it in the context of the people who would have thought this. Another reason we believe that H and P are distinct is because they flat out contradict each other. So I've got a couple. Now, there are lists online of hundreds and hundreds of biblical contradictions. I've picked a couple that actually come from P and H, specifically to highlight this point. But not only do they use different words, they disagree about what the laws were. So let's give an example and talk about, for example, sex during menstruation, and look at Leviticus chapter 15, verse 24. And it reads, as soon as I can find it, verse 24 says, "If any man lies with her," a woman who is menstruating, "and her impurity falls on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed in which he lies shall be unclean." And then it goes on with other things that you do to cleanse it. And then on the 8th day, it says, and presumably this is down in verse 29, this is for all the ones that came above. You wash your clothes, wait 7 days. And then on the 8th day, take 2 turtle doves, 2 pigeons, bring them to the priest, the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the priest will offer one for the sin and the other for the burnt offering. And the priest will make atonement for her behalf for the Lord, for her unclean discharge. And, ta-da, everyone is clean. It's not a big deal. "Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanliness," verse 31, "so that they do not die in their uncleanliness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst." Notice if a priest goes, there are degrees of holiness, and the further into the holiest degree you want to proceed, the more that is required of you, lest you be struck by the holiness of God, and that could kill you, and or God could choose to leave. If it became too polluted, and then God wouldn't be with us. You see, this is the concept of P. Notice the distinction. It is not a sin to have sex with a woman who's menstruating, but you become ritually unclean. You wash your clothes, wait 7 days, offer sacrifice, you're clean, and you can go into the temple again and not be afraid. But you have to do these rituals and these washings, otherwise it's a problem. But there's no concept that this is a sin. The same thing is true of a woman who is menstruating. That's exactly what she has to do. Wash her clothes, wait 7 days, right? It's not that menstruation is a sin, and it's not that sex during menstruation is a sin. There's no concept of sin here in the sense that we think of it. And by the way, a sin offering means a purification offering. It doesn't mean that there was an ethical violation. There's nothing ethical about this. It's a ritual cleanliness issue that has to be maintained so that you can go into the temple and not face death, and so that God will continue to live with us. Move to H. So let's look at chapter 18. And we've crossed that magic chapter 17 threshold. So in 18, verse 18, we have, and you shall, notice in the verse before, it's busy talking about incest. And then right after incest, it says, "And you shall not take a woman," hold on. I'm in the wrong place. Chapter 18. Verse 19. You shall not marry 2 sisters. You shall not marry your mother. It's all about incest. And then verse 19, right off of the incest, which is this ethical violation, it says, "You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstruational uncleanliness. You shall not have sexual relations with your kinsman's wife and defile yourself with her." Notice it's right in the middle of all these ethical violations. Very different. You shall not. It's a commandment. Whereas the other one said, don't do this without cleaning yourself first. This one just says, don't do it. It's wrong. And then, if we skip over to chapter 18, verse 26, we read, "But you shall keep my statutes and my ordinances and commit none of these abominations, either the citizen or the alien who resides among you." You can't do it, and someone else living with you can't do it because they would get you kicked out of the land. "For the inhabitants of the land who were before you committed all these abominations, and the land became defiled. Otherwise the land will vomit you out from defiling it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For whosoever commits any of these abominations shall be cut off from their people, expulsion." So the penalty, any of these abominations that we just listed, including having sex with a woman during menstruation, leads to expulsion. So H is far more serious about this than P. For H, if you do this, you will be exiled. Exile is the penalty for this particular sin. Now, chapters 18 and chapter 20 are these same chapters where we get the famous statements about homosexuality. So these are in the list, right? We're not going to read them, but they're in the list. Let's look at chapter 20, verse 18. And it says, finding it. If a man lies with a woman having her sickness and uncovers her nakedness, he has laid bare her flow, and she has laid bare her flow of blood, and both of them shall be cut off from the people. So this is interesting because 18 and then 20 has the same similar list of homosexuality, sex with a woman during menstruation, and incest, and having sex with animals are all listed in these things that are taboo. And again, notice the distinction between P and H. For H, the result is either expulsion or death. We have a similar thing with eating carrion, and I'm not going to go through those, but the verses are here. They're interesting. You can look them up. But for P, you can eat carrion if you want. It talks about finding a clean animal. It has to be a clean animal that has been, mauled by another animal maybe, and you don't want to waste the meat. So can you eat it? And P says, sure, but if you do, you're unclean. Same thing, wash your clothes, wait 7 days. You can do it, but it makes you ritually unclean, and you have to do these rituals. D says, don't do it, but you can sell it to the non-Israelite. They can do it. You've never seen D, but D is in Deuteronomy, and it has the same law about not eating carrion. But for D, no Israelite can eat carrion, period. That is not what P said. But you can give it to the stranger, the non-Israelite. And then H has just the same, no one can eat carrion. It's an abomination, and we don't, right? So, again, another set of contradictions. Now, I believe that these contradictions are obvious and inherent in the text, and you have to jump through some serious mental and intellectual hurdles and twist yourself in intellectual knots to try to talk yourself out of them, to pretend that they're not there. But if we believe in multiple authorships, multiple traditions, it makes sense that they would be there. And in the context of this particular one, it explains why we believe that H is its own little distinct thing, very related to P, but somewhere in the middle between D and P, and maybe even an intentional bridge between the two. But I want to go ahead. Let's do that before I jump into the implications. Yeah.
You may not be able to answer this, but
There's a lot of questions I can't answer.
over in Israel today, there are some very conservative people that run around in garb. Do they lean towards one or the other of these?
Towards D. So, as I understand the ultra-conservative Jewish movement, and we would probably need David Segedi or someone to answer this better than me, but as I understand them, they lean towards the Talmudic interpretation of these texts. And so these contradictions paved the way for Jewish interpretation for years to come. They knew that they were there. They didn't really pretend they weren't, but they treated it like a legal tradition in the U.S. There are laws in the U.S. that contradict, and they would try to interpret those laws in terms of a context in which one law would apply and the other would not, and that became the Talmud. So what would happen is someone would bring a case before the judges, and the judges would argue the case, and then the judges would the lawyers would argue the case before the judges would go back and they would deliberate, and then they would come back and they would write a prevailing view and a minority view. And so if you read some of these Talmudic literature, we have both the prevailing view and the minority view were preserved. So they almost accepted the contradictions and reveled in them, but then they came up with a majority view. And so modern ultra-conservatives, I believe, tend to follow what they see as the majority view in the Talmud as the Talmud interpreted these laws. So these laws became, and their contradictions, became the background of the debates that led to what became the standard interpretation, which is seen in the Talmud, which is then what they keep in their ultra-conservative orthodoxy. So it's not like you can keep these laws perfectly as they are, because you have to interpret them. No one can keep a set of laws without interpretation. The Talmud provides that interpretation for them. And I should add that the Talmud is very, very clever in dodging ethical problems in the text, in sometimes a very progressive way, for its time especially. Stone anyone who kills their... I shouldn't try to create an example because I'm making one up and it may not actually be in the text. But I know that they will often do things like, there's a command to kill all the Amalekites. And so the Talmud will say, well, how do we keep that command? The Amalekites are gone. We don't even know who they are. And how do we keep the command to kill the Amalekites? Well, we kill the Amalekite within us. And they will have these interpretations of how to keep laws that no longer make sense in our context. And they were very good at that and progressive. And then what happens when groups become conservative is they stop that process. Because if that process of creative interpretation continued, then they might be more likely to do things like accept homosexuality and to do the same sort of reworking that they have a history of doing. And so the question between a conservative, and this is true in Christianity today, this is why I'm taking a little bit of time to stop and talk about it. A conservative Christian has a history of interpretation, of explaining away difficult passages and dodging some of these bad ethical questions in creative and beautiful ways. And then they stop. And then that becomes the tradition, and you can't violate that, right? So the conservative Christian will stop and not realizing that they are a liberal Christian compared to first century, second century, third century. And then the question is, are you willing to allow that process to continue, or do you freeze it? But the idea that you do it without any interpretation is nonsense. Because A, the laws contradict, and B, even if they don't, you have to figure out how they apply today. And to do that, you have to figure out the cultural context in which they're given in the past. So let's talk about this. I want to talk especially about the contradictions. Those have been approached in what I will define as three separate ways, and it's not me. This came from some other people online, but you can talk about how the Christian Apologist approaches the contradictions, basically to pretend they're not there. You can talk about how the atheist, the evangelical atheist, approaches the contradictions, to use them to belittle the text. Or you can talk about how the biblical scholar uses the contradictions to notice the different authorship and the different traditions and the history behind that. So I'm going to quote Dr. Stephen DeMatteis here as he discusses some of these three groups. It says, while atheists are general, and I want to make sure, at least, I don't know what he means, because he may be more antagonistic to the atheist view than I am. I don't care if you don't believe. But from my perspective, there is a group of evangelical atheists for whom this statement very well characterizes what they do. So it says, while atheists are generally correct in claiming that the Bible does, in fact, contain numerous contradictions, from minute differences in narrative detail to competing theological and ideological agendas, they often present these contradictions in a shallow and belittling manner, an empty list devoid of substance, with little or no real knowledge of the text themselves, their authors, audience, and the historical and literary circumstances that produced them. The internet is full of such lists. Although often impressionable, the lists do little to foster a conversation about the Bible's text, nor do they help remedy the increasingly systematic problem of biblical illiteracy currently sweeping across our nation. I thought this was appropriate for a class titled Biblical Scholarship and Literacy. This is Dr. Stephen DeMatteis. Then he takes aim at the Christian Apologists. On the other side of this public debate are the Christian Apologists. In general, they perceive their mission as one of defending the Bible. But what this often boils down to is defending a particular belief about the Bible. Specifically, the perfect belief, that it has no errors, that it's a flawless text directly delivered from God. They're not defending the Bible, they're defending a view of the Bible. And to do that, I might add, they have to ignore the biblical text itself. They often talk about the plain reading of the text. The plain reading of the text says that homosexuality is wrong. And yet they will avoid the plain reading of the text and stand on their head in order to avoid the obvious contradictions in the text. They seek to defend ideas based on the beliefs and perceptions of a reading community that lived centuries after the texts were written. This is a far cry from actually knowing, understanding, and even defending the actual beliefs and the competing messages of the individual authors of the Bible once interpreted independent texts, often at the expense of understanding the text themselves. and on the terms of their once individual authors in the historical and literary context to which they originally belonged. Like the atheist position, then, the Christian Apologist position also does little to further a conversation about the texts of the Bible, their messages and their competing beliefs, and the worldviews of the authors. Rather, apologists merely succeed in fueling a more biblical illiteracy and miscommunication about the ancient text. I would add that what they've really done is create an idol. And I know this is a strong way of putting this, but they no longer worship God. They worship an idol, the Bible, and they don't worship the actual Bible itself because they're unwilling to look at what the text says. They worship a image of the idol created in their own image and their own understanding. A, by ignoring the contradictions, but B, also by going through these laws and applying which ones we should keep today and which ones we don't have to keep today based on their own social taboos. They have a list here of ancient taboos from an ancient group, and they will go down that list and say, well, this one is just a ritual taboo. We don't have to keep that today because the law is done away. We don't have to keep it. But then they get to one that they also have a taboo against, like homosexuality, and they'll say, we do have to keep this one today because it's an ethical concern, and the others are all just taboos. Whereas we've just seen the H author doesn't see a distinction. And so if you're willing to have sex with people while they're menstruating, or at least not kick them out of your churches if they do, you have no biblical justification to then treat one of those laws differently than the other. And if you do, what you've done is you've applied your own ethical code in how you interpret this ancient ethical code, which other people also do, I might add. But at least they're honest about it, instead of pretending that they're doing something when they're not. Yes, go ahead.
So one of the things we all have heard from conservative Christians is, well, but the Bible says that it is inerrant. And so you have to sort of factor that in, that either that's wrong and everything in there may be wrong, or that's right and you've got to believe everything. Is that actually true? Are there places where the Bible says that?
Okay, so for those, the question was, one of the things that conservative Christians will often say is, the Bible itself claims to be inerrant. So we either accept that or we reject the whole thing. I would argue that this is circular reasoning to a much higher degree than the documentary hypothesis. In other words, I know that the Bible is inerrant because the Bible says it's inerrant, and I believe that if it said that, it must be true because it's inerrant, but it's inerrant because it says it is, but because it's inerrant, I have to believe it when it says it's inerrant. Worse, the texts that claim inerrancy don't claim inerrancy for the Bible. The Bible doesn't actually claim inerrancy for itself. If you just read the text, it's full of contradictions, and these are contradictions that the redactor, which I will get to in just a minute, had no intention of shielding us from. The man wasn't stupid. He knew there were contradictions in the traditions he was collecting, and he left them there as they were without changing them. The redactor had no intention of shielding us from the contradictions. He put them in there. There are biblical verses that say things like, the Word of God is perfect. The idea that the Bible is completely the Word of God, 100%, and is the final rendition of the Word of God, perfect and inerrant, is a later idea. So if you start from that idea and then the Bible says the Word of God is inerrant, then you just came to the conclusion that the Bible is inerrant. But it starts with the understanding that the entire Bible is the Word of God. I think a good way to answer this question is, what do you believe the Bible contains? Well, I believe the Bible contains words ascribed to God, words ascribed to prophets, the records of historians, a collection of legal law codes, and the words of an ass that spoke to a prophet in his madness, which we'll get to in the book of Numbers, and the words of Satan are in there, right? So the fact that in that context the text says the Word of God is inerrant does not mean that the text ever intended to imply that a collection of texts is inerrant, a collection that did not even exist when that passage was written. So to answer your question, I believe the Bible doesn't claim inerrancy for itself. And even if it did, it would be circular. And I believe that it is one more passage that has been misinterpreted. the passage that they use to claim inerrancy, is itself one of the many misinterpretations that is using their own cultural reality, where there is a single book that exists that they can point at that did not exist at the time, and they're applying it back to the text and then misinterpreting the text because of it. Let's talk about biblical scholarship. I'm going to read what he says, and then I'm going to add some stuff. He says, nearly all the contradictions are the byproduct of a lengthy editorial process that brought together Israel's conflicting textual traditions, differing versions of the same story, competing theologies, ideologies, and even views about sacrifice, God, salvation, the priesthood, the monarchy, and so on and so on. After all, our number one witness to these contradictions is the Bible text itself, biblical text itself. In other words, the claim that the Bible contains competing ideologies and belief systems, contradictory versions of the same stories, and even competing versions of a history is a claim that the biblical texts themselves make. Our goal then is not to harmonize these differences and competing theory voices away so that the Bible substantiates our 21st century views and beliefs, but rather to listen to the competing voices and understand them on their own terms and not in the views of the later readers. I want to add, what would have happened if the redactor had gone through the text and harmonized away all the differences? He could have. We would have had a much more difficult time separating the text into their different sources, and he would have silenced ancient voices, and then if the Bible was being used as a historical text, historians would have been left with much less understanding of ancient Israelite history, of ancient Israelite theology, of their political views, of their distinct differences. In other words, for me, the Bible is reliable as an ancient textual witness of competing views of Israelite history because of its contradictions. The contradictions are why I think it's reliable, because it means that the redactor didn't bother to fix them, that he reliably produced these ancient traditions as they sat before him instead of playing with them. Whereas the Bible is reliable because of these contradictions. I know it's reliable and not having been fiddled with because the redactor left the contradictions in. The contradictions are evidence of its reliability, not its unreliability. And both the Christian Apologist, who pretends they don't exist, and the Biblical Critic, who wants to show that the Bible is nonsense because of the contradictions, are missing the fact that as a historian, I think the Bible is more reliable because of its contradictions, as a witness of these competing historical views that once existed. Yes?
When was the redactor? When did he use?
Somewhere between the 400 and 500 BCE,
Okay.
we believe. We know it's probably post-exilic, at least, because the redactor seems to have ideas and concepts that come about through the exile. So it's fairly late, but we believe, for example, J, the earliest text, probably is from the 10th century. So it's probably pretty early, we think. Yeah.
So, I'm going to make a provocative.
Be provocative. I already have been. Probably offensive to some of the people who will watch online, but...
Provocative thought. Suppose it's 1940 and Nazism is destroying Europe, and you're spending time going through Mein Kampf and trying to figure out where Hitler got some of these ideas from and debating them and discussing them. There would be just sort of a certain nastiness about wasting the time. So what if we say Christianity, particularly conservative Christianity, which it has been most of its history, but evolving, has done enormous damage to lots of non-Christians in the world and Christians in the world who are homosexuals and so forth, using this book. Isn't there a certain amount of strangeness about looking at it from this viewpoint of where did all of these come from, and isn't that fascinating, at the same time that it has been causing so much harm in the world?
Okay, so let me see if I can paraphrase that, because I know from previous people online can't hear you. So now I have to re-say what you just said and try to actually capture it. You asked a reasonable question, I think, and that is, if someone were to go through Mein Kampf, Hitler's text, and try to do a textual analysis on where he got his ideas from, there might be some pushback. Why not just point out that this is unethical stuff and move on? I think that's the essence of your question. And I think that's a fair question. I think my answer...
Especially while Hitler's damage is still being done.
Yeah, so especially if we assume that he'd won or at least still controlled a large part of the world and his damage was still being done. Let me counter that. What if by showing the origins of his beliefs and by studying those origins, we could recognize that they aren't what people thought? What if people thought that he'd been dictated to directly by God, but we could actually show that he had been borrowed some of his anti-Semitic ideas from his environment and from the culture of his day? And by so doing, we could undermine the misuse of, and the use or misuse of his words because of that underlying assumption that is clearly wrong when we look at the text itself. So that's my first. I believe that in this context, by studying the biblical traditions and where it comes from, we recognize that the fundamentalist view of the text is wrong. We show that it's wrong, and that if we just take the text itself seriously, we see that it's wrong. And by so doing, we provide a means for people to sit down and say, well, if it has this cultural context, then maybe I should apply it, if I'm going to apply it at all, with that nuance that helps people out of that view and therefore helps us to escape the damage that is being done. But there's another answer to this. Let's assume instead that Mein Kampf was written 2000 BC and that it described nations, America, Germany, France, and that these things were. I'm about to jump to something else, and I should try to do this logically, but I'm thinking on my feet. Let's assume that we had excavated some of these nations, France and Germany, and we knew, we hadn't found texts, but we kind of knew that they existed, and we saw evidence of their tanks, but it's been 3,000 years, 4,000 years, and we don't really know what's going on. We don't know why they're fighting, but we see destruction layers. So we know that they were fighting, but we don't know why. And then suddenly someone found Mein Kampf and pulled it up out of the ground and said, oh my gosh, this is unethical, what it says, but this explains the whole war, what was going on, what they were fighting about. It would be considered the greatest discovery of archaeological history if that happened in that order. Again, if Mein Kampf, if the World War II had been 2000 BC, if 4,000 years had passed between them, and if we didn't have the context, it would put flesh on the bones of what otherwise was a stale archaeological history. We have this problem with the Bible, that the Bible came first and archaeology came second. And so whenever archaeology shows that the Bible isn't perfect or finds an error in the Bible, we get this view that the archaeology is contradicting the Bible or something. But I want you to put yourself in an archaeologist's shoes for a minute and pretend for just a second that the archaeology came first and the biblical text came second. If we had discovered the biblical text intact as we have it today, after all the archaeology of ancient Israel and Canaan and these other things, it would have been considered the greatest archaeological find of all time. Imagine the Dead Sea Scrolls were exciting. This would be much more exciting. Scholars would be tripping over themselves to read this text, not because they thought that the text had perfect ethical views, but because it has historical information in it that puts meat on the bones of all the archaeological finds. Not because we really think the Garden of Eden lived, because it explains the mythology of the people who thought the Garden of Eden lived, who built these temples, and it would explain what they're building, what they thought they meant. And if they had come in the opposite order, we would appreciate the biblical text for what it is. This beautiful thing that helps us understand what's going on in the ancient world. Part of the problem is, as you point out, the biblical text has been abused to abuse people. And we're in this weird place where it is both the greatest archaeological discovery of all time, and it's been used to abuse people. And so what do we do with it? And from my perspective, by showing people what the text is, I believe, A, I can help people see the history. B, I can help them see what the Bible adds to our understanding of the ancient world, which is massive. And C, I can also at the same time, I believe, do the best thing I could possibly do to help undo the harm the Bible is being done. And this is an ongoing debate, but I believe that if you present to people an alternative, either be an atheist and don't believe in God, or be a fundamentalist Christian who accepts every word of the Bible as perfect, a large number of people will choose the latter. If you provide them an alternative where you say, well, what if we can believe in God if you want, but you also believe that the Bible was written by people trying to describe their experience with God. It was written by people who maybe were imperfect. It has contradicting views about what it means to have sex with someone while they're menstruating, what it means to be homosexual, that this wasn't a monolithic, absolute dictation by God. If you can do that and provide that alternative, you'll do more good in the world, whether you believe in God or not. I'm agnostic. I don't have a skin in this game, but I do believe that sometimes by presenting this as an either-or, either accept it all and believe it all, or reject it all, we leave people who have an emotional attachment to their belief system with no other place to go than fundamentalism. And that might do actually more harm. This is my own approach to this. And it's not one that I'm evangelical about in the sense that I'm going to disagree with someone who doesn't take my view. Like if you think the best way out is to just, say this is all superstition, we're not going to pay attention to it, and we don't even think it's worth studying, that's fine. That's not what I think the best approach is. But it's also not something that I'm going to, have a big fight with someone about. I'll just present what I think and move on. But I do think that this is maybe the best way out of the problem we're in, to hopefully convince people to take the text seriously, look at it, people who believe in it, convince them to take the text seriously, to look at it, and then realize it may be something different than what they thought. And that might provide them another way to view the text and maybe to do some of this creative interpretation that has been a history of biblical interpretation from early Jewish times to escape some of the ethical problems in the text. And Jews were very good at this. We can do it too. And there are other ways out. And again, I think there's nothing to clarify, there's nothing in this view of the Bible's history, that tells you can't believe in God. I don't believe that that's actually what it does. So if you're a believer and you're watching the video, watching my class, this isn't trying to talk you out of your belief in God. There's nothing in this that prevents you from believing. If you're a non-believer, there is nothing in this that makes you believe. This is just a historical narrative of what the Bible is. And once you have that context, you're free to then do your own work to try to interpret this in the ethical framework that you believe is best. But it gives you that freedom to no longer be forced to then say, well, the Bible says it must be true. I have to accept it, despite the fact that it's contradicting itself. Which again, if you can, so from a historical perspective, I got off on a major tangent, but I want to just point out, again, as a historian trying to use the Bible to understand ancient Judaism, the fact that the contradictions were left in by the redactor in the 5th century is why we can trust the text to tell us something about these ancient traditions. If they had removed all those contradictions and smoothed it over, then we would have lost that opportunity, and then the Bible would have been not trustworthy. So I know that there are people who use these contradictions to show why they don't think the Bible is trustworthy. I use them to show why I think it's a trustworthy source for this question. So the answer, can we trust the Bible, depends on what question we're trying to answer from the text deeply. If we're trying to use it as a law code for answering all of our problems, our ethical concerns, and we think that answers to every question will be in this text, it doesn't work. We can't trust it. But if we trust the Bible as an authentic window into some of these 10th century, 9th century, 7th century, 5th century ancient views of God, then it's a remarkably trustworthy text, and probably the best ancient text we have to describe religious beliefs for any community anywhere. It's been preserved and passed down remarkably well. And it's massive in its scope, scale, and preserves many contradictory traditions and viewpoints from the time. Are there any final comments or thoughts? I don't know if I answered your question or about why I do this. I probably haven't changed your mind, which is fine, but did I at least answer your question of why I think this is a good idea?
And I like your explanation about the third option, but I also would guess that most of the atheists would say, well, of course it's a good history of mythology.
Yes. Most of them would not disagree that it's a good history of the mythology of the ancient world. That is true. But most of them don't make the list of contradictions to show what different groups there were and how those different groups had different mythology. Now, that's probably not a bad thing for their goal. They are trying to, again, I think this is a key for me. The evangelical atheists, the people making these lists about why the Bible contradicts and stuff, they are reacting against a fundamentalist view of the Bible and showing that fundamentalist view is impossible. The Christian Apologists are also similarly making a defense of the Bible based on a fundamentalist view of what it is. So both of them are acting and reacting to fundamentalism while ignoring the other options of interpretation that are out there, which I believe they could do more good by pointing out the viability of these middle grounds that exist for many people. There's a long history of that middle ground. It's not like it's a new thing. Going all the way back to the earliest interpretations of the Bible, there were middle grounds like this. Like this is maybe some of the people. There's people who believe this is a real God who really interacted with people, but the people were in charge of writing it down, describing their experiences with God, describing what happened, and mixing it with their own myths about God, all while believing God is real and involved in the whole thing. And so that view has always been around. It is old. And in fact, it is a more authentic view of the text and a more ancient view of the text than our modern perfected view of the text. And so I feel like it helps to put that option back out there for people. And again, if the atheist side makes it an either or, they've already bought into one of the views of the fundamentalists that I think is actually the world's problems come from fundamentalism. Not from belief or non-belief, either one, but from fundamentalism. And so I want to start from a place where I don't accept the premise that the entire debate is based on. So let's see, next time we're going to do an introduction to the book of Numbers. Numbers will dive back into J.E. All of our other sources will reappear. It won't just be P&H. And we get a great story of a mad prophet whose donkey talks to himself, speaking of great mythology. It's one of the best stories in the Bible. I love it to death. It's both funny and moving and has an interesting ethical point behind it. To give you some resources for further reading, this is the individual I was quoting, Dr. Stephen DeMatti. And he's got a website called Contradictions in the Bible, where he went through every day and wrote down one contradiction that he found, just kind of to show. But every time he lists the contradictions, he talks about where it comes from. This is from the E-source, and the E-source are, this is their culture, this is their background, this is when they wrote. And this other one that contradicts is from the B-source, and this is when he wrote, and this is why we know they're different. And he gives all that context behind every contradiction he lists. And he's got hundreds and hundreds of biblical contradictions listed, but he also has that context behind every one of them, why they are informative, what they teach us about the biblical origins, etc. So there's a great place to go. Again, I've recommended this before, but the Bible for Normal People is a group of individuals who are believers. Like I said, I'm agnostic. They are Christian, but they are non-fundamentalist Christian. And so there's an episode 204 of the Bible for Normal People podcast called Pete Ruins Leviticus. He titles these things with his tongue firmly in his cheek. But this is where I got a lot of information for the talk. These are probably what I think the best commentaries for the book are by Jacob Milgram, Leviticus 1 through 16 and 17 through 22. Notice he divides his commentaries right at the break between P and H. But these are great commentaries on the book. He's got detailed descriptions of what the taboos, what the origin of taboos, for example, against homosexuality might have been. There's a taboo against homosexuality. Okay, well, where did it come from? Why did the Jews believe this way? What did they think? How did they differ from their neighbors in this regard? Was it common in the time? He's got the historical context for that, and it spelled out in great detail. It's very informative stuff. He also directly asked the question, why does it only forbid male homosexuality but not female homosexuality, which is not against the law, by the way. For whatever reason, it only describes male homosexuality, and in its description, it is explicit enough that it's obvious that it's only male homosexuality that is described as sinful. Why is that? I don't know. But he goes into some of the theories, etc. So both of these commentaries are very good. I recommend them. All right, thank you all for coming. Are there any other parting comments, questions? And go ahead.
Yes, when you or the people you quote give these lists of contradictions, are they ever separated as lists for those in Hebrew versus lists for those in English, and so on?
So my list, at least, I try not to list things that are only contradictions because of a bad translation. There are a few contradictions that just come up because we've translated it poorly. That was the question, by the way, are these lists of contradictions, just ones that come up in Hebrew or in English? Jacob Milgram, for example, the commentary, he does his own translation first before he then dives into the text and compares it to the other biblical text, Deuteronomy, E and J. So if you go to good scholarship, you will find only descriptions of the contradictions that are actually in there. What is actually more common is a contradiction exists in the original text, but it's been hidden in translation. People will choose to translate the text in a way that smooths over a contradiction that exists. That happens more often than the alternative. There are contradictions in the text that are smoothed over in translation. There's also ancient views of God that are smoothed over in translation. Some of the early versions are very anthropomorphic, and so they'll translate that away. But again, often the translation is hiding this stuff rather than this stuff coming up because of a bad translation. But if you have to get a good commentary before that can be kind of assured, because if you just look online, you'll find people engaging with the King James or something and ignoring what's really going on. Whether they see a contradiction in the King James and kind of ignoring what's really happening in the text. But any other questions or thoughts? All right, thank you all for coming. I hope what we've shared has helped you on your own journey, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.